Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Well, welcome back for yet another episode of Cross Connections. Congratulations, you've made it almost all the way through the book of Exodus.
Woo-hoo!
Woo-hoo! We are so grateful again to have Rabbi Robert Green with us for a second episode.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
I'm so glad to have you. All right, so we are now in the section of Exodus that might feel a little less familiar. As Rick mentioned last week, some of the beginning of this chunk is still familiar territory, water from the rock, the Ten Commandments, but then we start moving into a lot of the law.
And the construction of the temple, tabernacle, and the Ark of the Covenant, and all the pieces that are in the Ark of the Covenant, in what can be sometimes seen as like tedious detail. Like it's very detailed.
Welcome to the tedious detail section of the podcast.
Yeah, so we have stepped out of the comfy, cozy waters of just story, and we're getting into some of the harder sections that you probably didn't get to in much of Sunday school.
It's definitely not in those children's Bibles.
No. Or the rhyming Bible we discovered we have downstairs. We have the rhyming Bible in the gift shop.
Good.
So, I'm thinking of getting a copy of that from my congregants.
You should. They would love it.
I might get one for you.
They would definitely be fascinated by it, at the very least. Yeah, we've left the safety of the narrative. We're in the more kind of tedious section. Why? Why do we need all this detail? That's one of the things that's like the biggest thing I ask when I keep seeing like all this meticulous detail.
So let's talk about the building of the tabernacle, because there's a ton of detail in there. The measurements, exactly what's supposed to be used, how much of each thing is supposed to be used, materials that you think you'd have to travel far and wide to find. But why do we have that? Why is that story there? And one of the questions that I would start off with is, does God need the tabernacle? This is God's dwelling place on earth. Does God need the tabernacle? Or do the people Israel need the tabernacle for God? Is it so? That's a big question, because if you think about it, what's your thought? Does God need the tabernacle, or do the people need it?
God was doing just fine.
Well, and the people didn't seem to need it before this point. There weren't. I mean, Jacob would put up all of his pillars as like monuments to places where he interacted with God, but the people up until this point didn't seem to need a separate place.
So when the people were on the mountain, were at the base of the mountain waiting for Moses to come down with the commandments, they at some point thought, oh, he's not going to come back. Yeah. So we have to do something. We need to build an idol. Let's build a golden calf.
Right.
They needed something. And we know how that worked out. That didn't work out very well. But so when it's time to build the tabernacle, it seems like the people need the tabernacle. They've got to have something tangible to hold on to.
Yeah.
God, as we said in the last episode, God fills up all space. God is everywhere always. God doesn't need this little house to dwell in.
No.
But the people need this, and so this is sort of, in a sense, it's a microcosm of the universe as God created it, if you think about it. And it represents how our relationship with God, and our relationship to the world. So in the outer courtyard, that's more our independence and connecting to other people around us. But as you move into the actual structure and get to the Holy of Holies, then it's representative of a relationship with God, your connection to God, which is that really holy, is significant thing that goes on. So the people need the tabernacle. And then the tabernacle is, it's, as I said, you move in the spiritual development from the outer courtyards, which is the physical world, to the Holy of Holies, which is the divine union. It is a representative of of how God created the world. It's a miniature representation of the universe, so to speak. The Holy of Holies is considered the divine realm, or the realm of the heavens, and the outer courtyard represents the earthly domain. There are different ways to think about it. It can be talked about as being order and harmony. The detailed instructions of building the tabernacle, and they're very detailed, reflect the order and harmony of the universe. And that's something that we don't think a lot about. Unfortunately, we don't think a lot about order and harmony in the universe,
right?
And how fragile it is, and how we have to be careful not to disrupt it.
Fragile,
and we can now look around and see what happens when we disrupt it. But that was represented in the tabernacle too. And each element that was used in the tabernacle represented some aspect of creation. And I won't go here, but you can get very mystical about it and Kabbalistic about it, and talk about how it represents the 10 Sefirot. So it's, the tabernacle is talked about. It might be a detail. It might be one of those details that people have to get through. But in terms of midrash, in terms of commentary, voluminous.
Yeah. So I always, whenever I think about the tabernacle or the temple, which will succeed it, and the temple in Jerusalem, whenever I talk about that, our understanding today, and even over the past 2,000 years, about sites of worship are very different than what the tabernacle or the temple was. We have churches on every corner of every city in America. Here at St. David's, we have 2 worship sites across the street from each other, just on our campus. And they're places where people...
3 if you consider our outdoor chapel, too.
I did not consider the outdoor chapel.
And
we have 3.
And
You're
4 if you include the family service and the hall.
And Allen Hall. Oh, my goodness. So many places to worship in this place.
Maybe you should have a tour of this place. It's really impressive.
I should have a tour. But the tabernacle is not just like, it's another church or it's another worship site. It's the worship site for this nation of Israel. And later, the temple in Jerusalem will be the worship site, not just a big church or a fancy place, like the cathedral or something like that, but it's the place where humans can go and meet God.
And so I feel like there's some definitions that I just would love to have clarified. There's tabernacle, there's temple, there's also this thing in the tabernacle that's the Ark of the Covenant.
So let me clarify some of that for you. The tabernacle is what the people built in the desert, according to God's instructions, which are in the Torah.
Right.
And that is cooperatively constructed between the people and God. So an act of divine cooperation, perhaps, construction. The Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, is in the center of the tabernacle. And that is where the original commandments were kept, the original tablets were kept that were smashed, and the new tablets were kept. And that's a spot that only the Kohanim, the priestly tribe, would go into, and then only once a year. That's the same in the temple. The temple that was built in Jerusalem, as we understand, initially held all of the same things that the tabernacle held. When the temple was destroyed, there was nothing, and then later on a new temple was built. And when the second temple was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era,
right,
then there was no temple. And Judaism, so now we have synagogues all around. So you see, not all around, but you hear about synagogues all the time. So the Orthodox movement and the conservative movement, these are branches of Judaism, refer to places of worship in the Jewish world as synagogues because they're gathering places, and there is only one temple. They believe that there's only one temple ever, and it has been torn down, and unless it's rebuilt, there will never be another temple. So there are synagogues where people gather and worship. The Reform movement in Judaism refers to temples because they have decided that they are not holding out for another temple to be rebuilt. And in fact, they don't want another temple to be rebuilt. They don't want to go back to animal sacrifice.
That's good.
So is that so? If you're looking at the names of the places in your local town, if it's named, for example, Temple Beth El, does that give you an indication as to what vein of Judaism?
It should. And often, most of the time, it does. Most of the time, that would tell you that it's a Reform temple as compared to one of the other branches. And there's renewal and there's Reconstructionists as well. So like there are a bunch of branches of Judaism. Yeah. But I'm in a place in Basking Ridge, B'nai Israel, Congregation B'nai Israel, and the congregants refer to it as a temple. But I think that's just a colloquial. I think that's just what people, I don't think they understand necessarily. It's never been talked about, what the significance of calling something a temple versus a synagogue is. Maybe that stems from my younger years when it was more common.
So I've heard you say in the past that modern day Judaism and Christianity are sibling religions.
Right.
Because modern day rabbinic Judaism is not the Judaism of the temple or the tabernacle where you're slaughtering animals all day long, but it's a Judaism that's around the book, around the Torah, and around the teaching of Torah,
and around the table at home.
Right, and that really, it begins post Babylonian captivity when the synagogues started to be formed. But once the temple's destroyed in 70 and there is no more temple, Judaism and Christianity kind of grow up at the same time as these two modern day Judaism.
Right. Yeah, very true.
There hasn't been another temple since 70?
Nope.
That's fascinating to me that, people have never gotten around to. That's a really long time.
Well, it's a pretty hot real estate market in the center of Jerusalem.
Very hot real estate market.
So,
there,
and I think the
oh my goodness!
Wish everyone
I'm
could
sorry,
see Rabbi Green's face.
He just doesn't even know how to respond to that.
It's been pretty contested.
It's been a very long history.
I think the idea was if we were going to rebuild one, it would need to be rebuilt on the exact same site.
It would have to be rebuilt.
It's kind of contested.
Yeah.
So not going to happen unless there's World War III.
But I will tell you, just as an interesting aside, that there are people who have recreated parts of the temple that would go in the structure that they are storing in the old city of Jerusalem, waiting for the time when the temple will be rebuilt.
Wow.
I'm not one of those people. I'm not holding my breath for that, and I'm actually not lobbying for it either. That's
a real thing that's happening. Wow.
There's a red heifer that there's a farm with a red heifer, because you must sacrifice the red heifer and get the blood of the red heifer and consecrate all the vessels that would go into this new temple. It's like a thing.
Wow.
But again, it would be World War III before that would happen.
Well, we're not going to get into modern day geopolitics at the moment, but
probably was.
Back to the Bible. Let's go.
Yes. Back to the scriptures. So, are there pieces about this that or any key themes at this section of Exodus that Jewish commentators focus on in particular?
Well, so I talked about humans being co-creators with God, and that is something that is near and dear to my heart. And I know I'm not the only one, but the idea is that we're in a partnership with God.
Yeah.
And early in the Torah, God plays an active role, but by the end of the Torah, God is no longer playing an active role. And post-Torah, God doesn't.
Yeah, God goes quiet for a long time there.
God goes quiet, has remained quiet. And so, the idea that I have is that it's our job. God's quiet. We have to be God's voice. We have to do God's work. And so when we do that, then we'll create, in Judaism, the idea is that we're not striving to get into an afterlife. We're striving to create the world today as we want it to be. We're striving to create heaven right here on earth.
On earth as it is in heaven is
exactly
a phrase that some of us know.
Yes, I've heard it many times. That's our job. And that's, being co-creators, we began that when we were building the tabernacle, and we're still co-creating with God because we are still striving to make this world. It's called Tikkun Olam, repairing the world.
Oh, yes.
And we're still trying to strive for Tikkun Olam, to repair the world and make it the world that we want it to be. And that began in Exodus with the building of the tabernacle.
Part of what the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant to me is about God becoming close to us. That just being in heaven or wherever God was before wasn't enough, but that God wanted to come near. It wasn't enough. Yes, God heard Israel and saw its suffering in Egypt, and God brought it out of Egypt. But then God sought to live with his people, to dwell with his people. And the tabernacle is a mobile worship center. It's moving through the wilderness, and God is with them, close to them.
And God guides them through the wilderness. When the pillar of cloud rests over the tabernacle, then they set up camp. And they can set up camp for a really long time. And it's when it moves that it's time for the people to go. So God was, in essence, understood to be dwelling with the people. When we read that section of the Torah, we think, okay, God is hanging out with the people.
What does Mishkan mean? What's the direct translation?
Mishkan is it's another name for the tabernacle.
Okay.
It's the same thing.
So the tabernacle is movable.
Yeah. Because we're moving through the wilderness.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about the courtyard and stuff around it, and in my brain I was picturing something a little bit more permanent, like a temple. But this is a thing that you can actually
move,
pick up, and
it can be
go.
carried. Yeah. But even if what's interesting is even the temple, it's absolutely not portable. You can't carry it. But the tabernacle, it's set up. It's not just a really small thing. The actual tabernacle itself, but the structure includes the outer rings, and so it's actually fairly large. Mm-hmm. It's a community, and then people put their tents around so that the tabernacle was in the center. And so, but it's you can imagine that there's a structure, and then there are these circles around it where different things happen.
I see Israel's time in the wilderness as being a formational time for them. That they had been this slave people for 400 years, and now they're free, and they went to Egypt as a family. They're coming out as a nation, but they don't have a home, and they've never had any leaders or rulers or laws or anything. And so
only what Egypt put over them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But didn't have anything of their own.
Yeah.
And so how are they going to go from being this, homeless slave nation to being a real nation in the world? They need some formation. And that the law and the tabernacle is sort of those things that gives them the structure and the presence of God that they need to be this people.
And there's a lot of God is trying to say, here's what I need you to do. You have to do what I said. And Moses, here's what I need y'all to do. And you have to do what I said. And, they keep, they're growing. They're making their mistakes with their golden calves and other things. So it's, they're learning how to follow. God, it seems to me.
And another thing that happens that I think is really significant is that at some point God decides that the people who left Egypt cannot handle being in the promised land. They cannot handle that freedom. And so they have to die out in the desert. And the desert is not that, it's large, it's vast, but you can picture that land. It's not that vast.
Right.
And so it wouldn't take them 40 years.
No way.
No.
A couple weeks. They could have made it if they were hustling.
A couple weeks, yeah, a few weeks maybe. And so, but God decides that they need to die out in the wilderness, and the next generation is the generation that can go in because they were enslaved, and they just can't get beyond that. They can't. That's what the complaining that was in the beginning, where they were saying, "Let us go back to Egypt. It wasn't great, but at least we knew we were going to get dinner."
Yeah.
We knew what was going to happen. And if we were going to get beaten, we knew we were going to get beaten. We don't know what's going to happen here.
The trauma was too great of the being really in it.
Yeah. So it's. I think that's a really important point that was part of the formation of the people. We needed a new generation of leadership, so to speak.
Right.
Can we go back and talk about the Mishkan? The Tabernacle for just a minute. I think that, and maybe I said this and I'm forgetting, but I think that it's such an interesting, when you read it, it's so interesting to see what materials are used, and that everything that goes into it is very intentional, and just like the creation of the world was very intentional. And so, to me, it's a really cool idea that this very specifically designed structure that's built by the people according to God's instructions represents the world that we live in and the world that we will then inhabit for all of time that we inhabit this earth. So I just think that's a really a very cool idea.
Can you go into that a little bit more specifically? Are we talking about all the way down to the curtain, and the curtain's blue and purple with crimson? How
and
are
dolphin
those
skin
things?
and acacia wood and
So how is that representing that? What can you go a little deeper? Because I'm not sure I would make the jump.
So for one thing, a lot of these materials that are used are people have to travel quite a distance to get them. They're not going to be right there.
They weren't local.
You're not going to have a dolphin skin
in the middle of the
desert.
Right. Yeah.
So just as an example, so that's one thing, and so they come, and even the colors, some of those colors are made. I'm not sure if this is for the tabernacle. I know that on a tzitzit there's a prayer shawl that we wear when we're praying, and traditionally they have a blue thread in them.
Yeah.
And that blue thread, the dye from that blue thread comes from, it's going to sound gross, crushing snails. Blue is a hard dye to make if you're a nerd like me and you've learned about that. And so
it's
we'll talk about that. I'm very curious.
Crushed snails, indigo. There's very limited places to make blue
and
dye
these are
from.
colors that you find listed as being important to have in the tabernacle. So this is this kind of thing. It's saying, okay, this is it's not just right here. It's everywhere. This stuff comes from everywhere. God is everywhere. All of this stuff belongs to God. This is all created by God. Okay. So it's very...
and it's a little version of creation in miniature.
Exactly. You can't see me, but I'm extending my arms out as far as I can, because that's what...
Yeah.
It's supposed... It's a podcast.
Well, so that's
where's the camera?
No, that the big open arms that kind of means everything and everywhere, right?
Yeah. And so I think that's really significant, and that's what we see in that the tabernacle, which is relatively small, encompasses everything.
Yeah,
which is a going back. I mean, the narrative of the Bible up to this point started very wide. The whole world's created. The whole world floods. It's the first 11 chapters are all about the world, and then we focus down on a family, which then becomes a larger family, which then becomes a nation. And so we're focused in on this one nation, and yet this one nation is given this this pattern of a worship site that is reminiscent not just of them, but of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. It's like going right back to the beginning, right? That God is not just a national God who's for just this people, but really God is for the whole thing.
God is for the whole thing and for everyone.
Yeah. And I think at just kind of a base level read, you haven't read this before, you're not going to know that or pick that up on that, right? Like, I don't know where acacia wood grows. Not everybody knows how
snails.
To make blue dye.
I don't understand why you don't know about acacia wood.
I don't really remember why. I think I read a book about the color blue one time.
Can I take us in a slightly different direction?
Yeah.
Because sort of like I did at the end of the last episode, there are the Christian New Testament then reflects back on the tabernacle and specifically wants to make, just like I said in the last episode, that Matthew wants to make a link between Jesus and the story of the Exodus and present Jesus as almost like a new Moses. There are places in the New Testament where the New Testament authors link Jesus to the tabernacle. So in the prologue to John's Gospel that we just read a few weeks ago, right after Christmas, the Word became flesh, and most of the time it's translated and dwelt among us. But the Greek word there is the word for tabernacle. Jesus became flesh, human, and tabernacled among us, as if to say that Jesus is this tabernacle now. There's when Jesus takes Peter and James up on the mountaintop for the transfiguration, Jesus is revealed as sort of bright shining as the sun. Moses and Elijah show up with Jesus. And Peter says, why don't we build 3 dwellings, which is again the word for tabernacle. We have this divine presence here. We got to build something and we got to contain it, sort of like our ancestors did in the wilderness. Towards the very end of Revelation, like some of the last words of the New Testament, Revelation 21:3, behold, the dwelling place of God is with humanity. And again, that dwelling place is just the Greek word for tabernacle. And so God has tabernacled once more with God's people. God has come close. Also interesting is the account of Easter morning in the Gospel of Luke when they go to the tomb and they look in and Jesus' body isn't there. But there are 2 angels, one at the head of where Jesus' body was and one at the foot of where Jesus was, which is reminiscent of the top of the Ark of the Covenant, where you have 2 cherubim on either side of the cover facing each other.
And, I didn't notice that.
Oh man, so good, right?
Wow, that's
here. And by that point, the Ark of the Covenant was lost, right? There was no Ark of the Covenant in Jesus's Jerusalem. But when Luke tells the story, he's like, but the Ark of the Covenant was right there in the tomb.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Jesus was upset with how the temple was being run.
Yeah.
So
turned over the tables.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. But so when he was saying the dwelling place of God is with humanity, was he saying that we don't need a temple? We are temples.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying. Right? Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, later Paul will say, you're to take care of your body because you are temples.
Your body is a temple.
Temple of the Holy Spirit. And so we don't need this thing anymore. Also interesting, most of the New Testament, most of it was written post-70. So after the temple had been destroyed for the last time.
That's a key point to know about our Gospels.
And so and for all 4 Gospels are written after 70.
Yeah.
And so people were at that moment, years after the destruction of this beloved temple, are like, oh, we need this back. We need to build it back. And the first Christians writing the first Christian scriptures are like, no, we don't need a building anymore. It's Jesus. It's in you. God has come so near that he's inside of you. So you don't just need a building anymore.
Right.
So
but come to church anyway.
Oh, please come to church. Yes.
There's this song, Sanctuary song. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
God prepare me to be a sanctuary.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's What I think is really cool is that it's sung in Jewish circles as well as Christian circles.
Is it?
Because
not
we
aware of that.
understand ourselves as being sanctuaries to God as well.
Yeah.
But of course, that's what we were talking about, sibling relationships.
Yeah.
If one group finds out that the other group feels the same way, they'll stop.
Can't have that.
If they do it, we can't.
It's exactly
just-
like siblings, right?
Yeah.
It's
It
is.
exactly like, yep.
But then you have those things that you have in common, and you're like, people know, like, oh, I can tell your siblings.
Well, here's the idea about siblings, and this is what I try and remember, and I try and talk to people about. When we're little, we fight with our siblings. As we get older, we realize that we actually have a lot in common, as you just said.
Yeah.
And we love our siblings. And so we have these nice, wonderful relationships.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that we're moving in that direction. We can hope, Rick.
Yeah.
You know.
We don't always have to see completely eye to eye with our siblings
No.
to love them.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
That's right, brother.
Indeed. Brother, sister.
Sister. Thanks.
Yeah, this is a treat.
Robert, so we're doing this thing where we're reading the Bible cover to cover, Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. Do you have any words of wisdom for our people as they
As we continue forward,
continue on this?
we've got
We're
your
just in the beginning.
thoughts on
Yeah.
Exodus, but we still have Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
So I don't have words of wisdom, but what I do think is that I would invite people to, as I read the Bible, I try not to think that this is the end. In Judaism, it's not the end. Like, this isn't the final word. There's all this, as you talked about, Midrash, these stories that we come up with to help us understand, and all this commentary. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, that's the smallest piece of liturgy that we have. The commentary and the Midrash is huge,
Extensive.
in comparison. Like if the Torah were one book, the commentary and Midrash would be an entire
Fill
Library
libraries.
of Congress.
Right. Yeah.
So, and so that's, everything you read at least in the Hebrew scriptures should provoke you to ask a question. Everything you read, you should be saying, okay, so what am I supposed to learn from this? And how do I understand this today? Because you're going to come upon, especially when you get into Leviticus, you're going to come upon some commandments that are going to seem really foreign. Like, why would we do this? This makes no sense. Well, maybe it doesn't make sense today, but it's important to remember that when the Bible was written, it was a very progressive document. It was an edgy document. And so
That's interesting.
you have to understand it for the time in which it was written. But then you also have to say, okay, so what does that say for me today? What does this tell me about how I want to live my life today? We should always be asking ourselves, what of what I'm reading is telling me something about how I want to live my life today? Because that's why we read the Torah. It speaks to us because it inspires us.
Yep.
We have to keep asking ourselves, how is this inspiring me?
That's beautiful.
I'll take that.
That's the way I think of, Pentecost and the
Story of God isn't
People going
over,
out.
right?
No.
It's still moving.
as one particular denomination likes to say, God is still speaking.
Yeah.
I like
That's
that.
not Episcopalians. That's a United Church of Christ, I
I
think.
think so.
Yeah.
UCC.
Yeah.
But they're right.
But I agree. I agree with them on that point, for sure.
Well, and if you think that it's our task to bring God into the world, then we should be really careful about what we say when we speak.
There's definitely stuff about that in the New Testament.
Oh, yeah.
I'm
About what
looking, I'm
comes
going
out
to
of it.
follow, I'm going to keep listening.
Oh, good. Well,
Fabulous.
maybe we even have you back sometime if you.
I'd love it.
Us.
It'd be great. Well, it's been wonderful to have you with us, Robert.
It's been a pleasure for me. Thank you very much. And the three of you are very interesting, good people, and I really enjoy spending time with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. All right, folks. So next week we finish up Exodus and we move into Leviticus.
Here we go.
It's getting serious now, folks.
Gird your loins.
All right. Thanks, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot VanHoy,
and Natalee Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalee Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and MoodMode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.